Hello there, this is Harold George. I'm the Extension Services Manager for the St. Johns County Public Library, and we are so pleased today to be speaking with Tim Deegan of First Coast News. Tim Deegan has been an icon of meteorology in the Northeast Florida area and probably across the nation for a very long time, and we are so glad. And today we're going to talk to Mr. Deegan in the context of NASA at My Library, because our library system is one of 72 libraries across the United States that is part of the NASA at My Library program. So hello there, Mr. Deegan. How are you?
Hello, Harold. I am fantastic. Thanks for having me on and the comments. And I'm honored to be here with you. So thank you very much.
That's a pretty cool tie you have on there. I hope that's an image that has nothing to do with those colors.
No, it does not, has nothing to do with orange and blue. It has lots to do with, for those who look at satellite pictures or hurricanes, this actually has historical significance. So this is an infrared satellite picture of Hurricane Matthew. Cool. As Matthew was going by us. Now, of course, for anybody in Northeast Florida, we were hit by Matthew, but what I mean is the eye wall, thankfully stayed just offshore. But yeah, this is my wife put that together for me.
It's true. I sometimes wonder if people went so far as to, was there a Matthew baby boom? Were there people named Matthew? It's one of those names that definitely looms large in our area of the country, yes, as well as many other places. We were very fortunate. But one of the things that is really interesting, I mean, I can remember, growing up in Florida, watching those satellite maps. And even when I was a kid, we still had a pretty cool, way of looking at weather from outer space. But one of the things I've always wondered is in the old days, you hear about like the Great Hurricane of 1938 and how that really just sort of suddenly came upon everybody up in the northeastern part of the United States. Would you say that more than anything that the space technology developed as part of the whole space program has really advanced meteorology and predictions, or is it a combination of old school and new school?
Harold, it's certainly a combination, but I'm glad you brought that up, because actually I think of it as two different universes. When I first started at First Coast News, which back in 1982 was just called Channel 12, the chief meteorologist there had his own private forecasting office. And I got to work for him as well, and some of his retired Navy guys. In fact, some of those guys actually used to be hurricane hunters. Bottom line is, they were around back when they didn't have satellite pictures. And I was and am still amazed. How did you forecast when you couldn't see it? Really, just a whole different world. Briefly, I'll talk about the 1938 hurricane. For those who don't know, not only did that hit New England very hard, but it did what unfortunately the big hurricanes can do late in the season, and that is that they can be lined up with the jet stream, which by late season, especially up north, can be significant. And so what that meant was this hurricane, which was ferocious enough, got caught up in the jet stream, and it came toward New England at 60 miles per hour. Now, for those who don't know hurricanes, if we see a hurricane moving along at 10 to 15, that's actually pretty quick for a hurricane. The nice thing about just 10 to 15 is it gives us time to respond. But you're right. In 1938, they didn't have satellite pictures. And here was a hurricane that basically went from an area north of the Bahamas to New England in about a 24-hour period. So they just didn't have any time to prepare.
Wow, that's crazy. And that's the thing too, is that now, this event that we find ourselves currently in, the COVID-19 response, I've heard a few people refer to as a very slow rolling hurricane experience, because in our part of the country, at least, that's what we're used to when it comes to the concepts of lockdown, stay home, is the hurricane preparation or evacuation, which is definitely something that we don't have to do this time around. But I'm just curious, has the current experience of the COVID-19 response affected the way you've had to work or deliver the weather news in any way, shape, or form?
Well, it has. In fact, actually, I do the weather like I'm doing this Zoom right now. Our station took the concern and the advice from the scientific experts very seriously. And so they came up pretty quickly, amazingly, with the way to basically keep as many of us at home instead of going into the station, the TV station, as possible. And so I have been now, as I'm talking to you, I think this is day 67 or so. But I've been working out of my home. Now that's one of the really nice things about technology, is that since everything, just about except for me eyeballing the clouds, is digital, then all of the data that I go into the station for, actually I can get on my computer here at home, which is amazing. Now, if this had happened 40 years ago, that would not be the case. I just wouldn't have the data here. I would have to either go to the station, go up to the National Weather Service to get the data, but fortunately I can gather it all here. Now, when there's a tornado watch, we had Tropical Storm Arthur go by. Under those situations, I do go into the station, but it's really more of let's make sure everybody, and there's just a couple of people in the station right now during the pandemic situation, but make sure everybody's on board with that scenario. But yeah, 90% of the time I've been working right here. But I would like to go on, since you brought up the pandemic. I think what I'm hearing from certainly people who I work with, and even some of my neighbors, is that you're right. For any of us who have lived through a hurricane threat, hit, evacuation, you learn that it's way more than just the drama of the actual hurricane, right? It's hearing about it for the longest of time, and then a while to get the all clear. In an odd way, I think this pandemic, because for many of us, we're into our plus 60 days, and at least for some, at least what I'm hearing from the experts, in some form or fashion, the world's going to be different until we get a vaccine. That's so much longer than a hurricane. So in its own way, it at least in my mind, has turned the whole of hurricane evacuation event into at least a shorter time frame than it used to seem, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And I have the honor of working during an event of some sort, like the hurricanes or the fires of the late 90s. They asked people from different county departments to work at the Emergency Operations Center, which I do. And I've really, from the 90s forward, have really seen the benefit. We go the before, during, and after experience. And those who are prepared long before they ever hear about something going on are always those who are better off. And people, unfortunately, those who don't have much are often the ones who suffer. So we ask anybody to step up and help. And also the recovery process is the one that goes on for so much longer than people have it in their minds. And I think this is definitely going to be a parallel in a way that we need to remember. This is an experience that will go on for a long time. So
Harold, I just want to double underline that. I think that's such a great point, in that I think sometimes for those of us who have a lot, for those of us especially who are independent, who don't have people in our homes, or nearby that are absolutely dependent on others, that even a hurricane can seem like not that big of a deal. And yet certainly if you're dependent, if you don't have a lot materially and or as far as technology is concerned, it's a big deal. I just sort of want to underline this without getting too heavy. But in my 40 years of doing this, there's the science of forecasting, and then there's the science that social meteorologists do during the winter, which is to go back and see who was impacted most significantly. How can we learn better to help those who need the information the most? And what we find is that both those who need the information the most, and unfortunately, tragically, those who may even lose a life, it's extremely focused toward the elderly who are home alone, or maybe with one other, or single moms with children who maybe don't have a vehicle. So I just want to double underline what you just said. I think just like this pandemic, that after a while, for those of us who are healthy, who feel good, we can almost get this attitude of what's the big deal. And yet, for those, there are those who need the rest of us who happen to be independent and have that technology.
Well, and I just want to reiterate, from my personal life, work life, I've seen the leadership that First Coast News has given in that experience. I actually have a friend, Anthony Perucci, who works for First Coast News, and he's talked for a long time about how very serious the organization has taken this. So and it's nice to have that leadership in our community. So we thank them for that.
Yeah, thank you.
So you've mentioned the phrase 40 years a couple times. So I'm thinking you must have gotten your start when you were in grade school, because so would you mind giving us a little bit of background of how you got started or interested in
Sure.
career that you now have?
Sure. And I know you're joking, although really I did get my start even before grade school. So without making the story too long, when I was evidently 4 to 5, I was drawing clouds that eventually became weather maps. I would do it all the time. Wow. And my parents realized that this kid's kind of weird. I'm sure they said that in a loving way. Anyhow, they happened to take it to one of the secretaries. Secretary saved it. Bottom line is, got my degree in meteorology from Texas A&M University in 1981. I was 5 years old back in 1964, but they had saved that weather map that I drew when I was 5 and framed it. And so when I graduated, they said, "Hey, Tim, you might enjoy this," and I still have this. So in many ways, I have been doing this since I was young, and I have it in my weather center to remind me. And I say this in a loving way to my boss, but I remind myself that when my boss is making me wish I wasn't at work, I do look at that picture frame of the weather map and say, "Hey, I'm a pretty lucky guy. I get to do what I love to do." Now, as far as right here in Jacksonville, I came here in January of 1982. So this is my 39th hurricane season. Wow. Here on the First Coast, and I appreciate everybody who's put up with me for nearly 4 decades.
Well, I mean, you've been a part of our community in a way that, I mean, you talk about newscasters or anchormen, like Walter Cronkite was always voted the most trusted man in America. And you do remember people from the local and national stations, but sometimes I think that the weather person, the weather forecaster, really becomes a part of your home, because they are a person that one way or the other, you feel like they're going to give you what they know, the news. And often we try to find, we look for comfort, either comfort in knowing to get the heck out of Dodge, or comfort in knowing that we're going to be okay. But you mentioned that you drew clouds, and something that we noticed when we follow SpaceX a lot and the launches, and this whole NASA at My Library program has really raised my awareness. I'd always been interested in the space program, but I think I'd gone to the back burner for a while. And you notice when they talk about the launches and the scheduled launches, I read something about the cumulus cloud effect. And I'm wondering, I mean, do certain types of cloud cover affect launches more than others that you're aware of?
Well, yeah, I'm not an expert on that, but I'm with you. I certainly, being involved in science, NASA has always fascinated me, and I still have the headlines from when we walked on the moon and the whole bit. But yeah, then moving to Florida, it just becomes part of your life, right? Watching the launches. And so then as a meteorologist, and then as a forecaster, not only do I want to see the launch, but I learned pretty quickly around here that people want to know, will they get to launch it? And very often it is weather dependent. And yes, what I have learned is the lower the clouds, and cumulus clouds tend to be our lowest clouds, then the more they can restrict visibility. And some more, that tends to be a threshold that is looked at as to whether or not they're going to launch. Now, certainly winds even at 20 and 30,000 feet can be a factor. It's one of the reasons why places like Florida are good places to launch, because since it's so seldom that the jet stream is this far south, then winds that are too high at 30,000 feet tend not to be a limiting factor. But occasionally, especially during the winter, they can be. So yeah, the cumulus effect is a big deal, and probably is, as far as just, if you don't know all the data and you're just wondering if the launch is going to go, but yet you can go into that NASA site and see what the weather's like around the launch site. If you don't see cumulus clouds, that's a good sign.
Okay, that's good to know. And and if you don't know, I mean, it's pretty easy to find ways to identify clouds on the web today, and of course the library has a ton of information about that as well. And of course, I think a lot more people have become, there's like 3 places that I notice when I'm around people when we're talking about hurricanes. They go to Mike's weather page, they go to the First Coast News, or they go to the site for NOAA. And I'm wondering how often, I mean, do you guys work pretty close in conjunction with NOAA? Do you communicate back and forth with them? Are you
yes,
of NOAA?
Yes, absolutely. Definitely NOAA. NOAA is the umbrella for, let's say, weather 24/7, 365 days out of the year. And then the National Hurricane Center is the focus for anything having to do with the tropics. So yes, we're in constant conversation with NOAA, with the National Weather Service. You brought up First Coast News several times, and especially when there is a storm threat, whether it's a tornado, a hurricane, fires for that matter, we not only do we feel like it's a public service responsibility, actually part of our FCC license is that under those situations, we have to be a public service. In fact, there's times where we may interrupt the program for a tornado watch that might really involve mostly the Okefenokee, but there are people who live there, and others will get upset about that. And we do that, yes, because it could be a serious situation. We also do that because we have to. It's part of our responsibility. And so it is a two-way street. NOAA makes sure that we know what they're thinking. We get to pick their brain. National Hurricane Center, especially for those of us who have television markets on the coast, keep a constant relationship up with us. In fact, a little side note, I don't think he'll mind me telling you this, but currently the public relations official for the National Hurricane Center, his name is Dennis Feltgen. Back in the early 80s, he was a broadcast meteorologist in Minneapolis, was still very respected. Well, that's back when I got my AMS seal of approval, which is just kind of like, you need to have your degree, but then it also means you've gotten approval for how you communicate the weather forecast to the public. Okay. So it's a seal that you get. Well, what, at least back then, what you did is you recorded yourself a few times. You sent it to 5 people on the board, and they had to approve. And the person who ran the board back then was Dennis Feltgen. So Dennis Feltgen, who back in 1983 signed off when giving me my seal of approval. That's pretty cool. He's basically still sharing with me official information from the National Hurricane Center all these years later. So yeah, there's definitely a connection, and as years go on, it gets kind of intimate. And I'll just say one more thing about that. Of course, communications between everybody is so important, but in any of the sciences that are inexact, and I think the more we learn that most sciences are inexact. What that means is even the most brilliant people, and I'm talking about some of the people who, and the National Hurricane Center, who their only job is to forecast the intensity of a hurricane, one of the toughest things to forecast, that even they will admit that, or they'll say, this is how I interpret the computer models. How do you all interpret it? So that back and forth can become very significant to help all the forecasters make sure we're not missing something that might help us communicate the forecast better to everybody else. It's truly a community. It absolutely sounds like, and it's kind of like, I mean, a lot of professions, the library world, there are people that are known across the country, across the state, and that people you'll see for many, many years and work with. So it's good to know too, because that's also a huge hive of information and knowledge that you all share back and forth. So I mentioned the Emergency Operations Center, and the staff at the St. Johns County Emergency Operations Center are some of the coolest people I know, and they spend a lot of time focused on what could go wrong.
and, you know, and planning for that and doing their best to prepare and hopefully prevent the worst case scenario. And yet there's some of the most positive and up people I've encountered, because you would think if you spent your year focused on disaster, that it would be hard to stay. And I'm wondering if you have any is it your perspective? Do you do anything to manage the fact that you're always looking? I mean, hurricane season, they started talking about hurricane season, you know, 2 weeks after everybody's locked down. And then we're like, can we get another week before we start worrying about that? But it's real. And so I was wondering if you have any personal approach that keeps you in a nice, even-keeled spot, so to speak.
I think it's a great question, and don't let me talk about go on for days on this.
Great.
I think certainly, I think there's the obvious answer that some of us learn in Scouts and others learn as you go through life, that it's best to be prepared. But it's a great question. How do you have yourself and those you love best prepared without constantly worrying about what else do I need to be prepared for?
Right.
And so the way I look at it is the more planning I do as an informed, so I need to learn. There's always more to learn, always, which is why I love the libraries. I mean, there's just always more to learn. The more I learn, the more I'll be prepared for any possibility. And therefore, if I really feel like on that particular day, I've done all I can to prepare. And of course, as a broadcast meteorologist, I'm talking about not just for me and my family, but for what we call the First Coast. Then if I happen to wake up at 3:30 at night, which I tend to do a lot, I worry a lot less, because I feel like, okay, I did what I could, and then and if I get some decent sleep, I'll be able to do it again tomorrow. So at least it's taken me a while, but what I have learned is it actually helps me check off my worry list that we've done what I can. And I guess another thing I remind myself with a smile, I think it's Mark Twain, but somebody said something like, a lucky person is one with many options. And I think a person, especially for instance, when it comes to weather, the options meaning if you've prepared, you know what you and your family need to do if you need to evacuate, if you can evacuate,
right.
If you're not going to have power, if you're not going to have enough food, if you're not going to have a vehicle, you know, and if you've gone through all this checklist, which is why I love to have people talk about, as much as they don't want to during the winter and spring, but especially when it comes to hurricanes, you know, do it when the adrenaline isn't flowing. Do it with your family when everyone's not yelling at each other, trying to make decisions, you know, like that. This is really the best time to make those decisions.
I agree. My personal experience before, you know, I have to admit, I think a lot of folks in our part of Florida have taken more comfort than we should in our personal position related to the Gulf Stream, or whatever we believe is our advantage over the rest of the state or other parts of the East Coast of the U.S. And so I have never been a big worrier about hurricanes. I take them seriously. And then one night, I get an automated phone call from the Emergency Operations Center saying that I'm part of the evacuation zone. I've never been part of the evacuation zone before. That was the first time I think I've ever panicked, because I did not have a plan. As smart as I thought I was, I did not have a plan. And I actually pulled together a lot of good things in the next 2 hours, but I never want to experience that again. And there's no point in it. So you're right. It's all about, I mean, I think there's that saying, opportunity favors the prepared. I have a random question for you, just because I was looking at a map earlier about the trade winds, and on the map, you know, in one area of the globe, it said hurricanes. And in one area of the globe, it said cyclones. And so from my really sketchy knowledge of the whole experience, I think they're similar, but I'm curious why one is referred to hurricane and one's a cyclone.
Great question. And you're not alone. People ask it all the time. So some real quick vocabulary, and then I'll get into the variations geographically. Okay. So to be technical, every low pressure system is a cyclone. That just means the winds are blowing in toward the center. And every high pressure system is an anticyclone. Okay. So So therefore, a blizzard and a hurricane are both cyclones. And I think that's when it starts to get confusing. Now, when it comes to the name for hurricanes, as far as us humans know, the first name that was actually used was typhoon, which of course they still use in the Western Pacific. And very, very loosely defined, typhoon means evil wind. And that's how we came up with hurricane, that in the West Indian language, again, I'm talking very loosely here, that evil wind was hurricane. And so if anybody's wondering the order of things globally, typhoon came first. Then in our part of the world, we started using hurricane. And then in some of your relatively newer countries that now have also hurricane warnings and watches and whatnot. Let's say the modern day vocabulary. In countries in which their language was not originally, or is not even now, English, they just came up with the very basic cyclone.
Okay.
And so, for instance, they will then talk about it is the tropical cyclone time of the season. In fact, if you look at some of those local or global maps, in some areas, you'll see either TC over the satellite picture. Very often you'll simply see TC, and that just means this is a tropical cyclone that they're watching. But it's really all one and the same animal.
Very interesting. I like that. Something. I mean, I have to admit, the wheels are always turning in my head. And on my way into work today, on the radio, they were talking about today is the 40th anniversary of the eruption of Mount St. Helens. And I can remember that my brother and his family lived in Spokane at the time. So they had a very, very real experience of that. We just saw it on the news. And then last week, I remember reading about what was referred to as the year without a summer, 1816. And a lot of that supposedly was influenced by volcanic eruptions the previous year. And I'm wondering, they didn't mention it in the article, was there any impact on our weather systems that you know of as a result of the eruption of Mount St. Helens?
There's been a lot of study about that. And when you get globally, it gets pretty tough. But some peer-reviewed science has supported what you alluded to even back in 1816, that a volcanic eruption, especially a major one like that, in which the ash gets thrown up into the jet stream, 30,000 feet, which means eventually, if you can detect it, have good enough detectors, you can detect it around the whole Earth. And in fact, what's amazing to watch in some of the newer computer model generations of when there's an eruption is that if it's a big enough eruption and lasts long enough, not only does it go all the way around the Earth of that hemisphere, let's say it happened in the northern hemisphere, eventually some of that even gets down into the southern hemisphere. Wow. So an easy answer is it definitely impacts the weather. It has to, but there's even been peer review that shows, especially for major volcanic eruptions, it will impact the temperatures and actually drop them by a degree or two, which again, for some people may not sound like much, but globally, that is a big deal. It's that knowledge that back in the 60s and 70s that had some wondering that if humans were putting so much pollutants into the atmosphere, were we going to eventually cause our atmosphere to cool? And there was some thinking that way. Once there was some peer review science and people really started looking at it, they realized, it might cool things initially, but in the long term, there's this thing called carbon. Now, this was back in the 60s and 70s, so it was a long time ago for some folks, that might actually cause something called the greenhouse effect. Right. And so what's interesting to me, of course, I'm going on to global warming here. What's interesting to me is the idea that enough ash and then, what about pollutants was enough to cool the Earth actually became the basis for greenhouse gases and the concern. And of course, greenhouse gases means beyond just carbon, but the concern that we may be influencing the Earth's weather. Could humans put enough up there to do that? the answer pretty much became yes. And then, oh, you know what? It's not actually going to cool us. Overall, it's going to cause this warming. But really, a lot of that originated with what us humans noted way before there were satellite pictures of what volcanic ash did.
And I mean, I remember reading, the Farmer's Almanac talked about that year as as the effect on crops.
Sure.
And I am as guilty as the next person about I call it Dr. Google when I don't feel well and I'm trying to figure out what's going on. We all, and in the library world, we actually have whole classes where we study about the fact that you can provide as many experts and expert knowledge as possible in something, but people really want to talk to grandma about what's going on because they trust grandma. And so I imagine that a big part of your job, along with knowing and along with the science, is also establishing that relationship with the people that you hope to help and serve on a daily basis. And I'm wondering if that's something that is a much more conscious effort in your job, or is it something that you integrate with what you do on a daily basis? Or how do you make contact with the public, so to speak?
Well, so I'll answer that part first, and I'll go to the broader one, which is one I'm still learning with. So when I first started, so if you think about it, this is my very first TV job was at Texas A&M in the fall of 1981. So let's say fall of 81, and then I've been learning since. So initially, it was I would talk to the public because they would call me on the telephone, the thing attached to the wall. Or letters, and people would ask me questions, and that became a way back and forth. And I did that. I was always a letter writer, but what really helped me there was in television. They're always doing surveys. They're trying to figure out what people want, what people are thinking, what people don't like, what they do like. And I was told very early on, maybe this was 1982, 1983, that Tim, in the Jacksonville market, every person who writes a letter, we count that as equivalent to that's what 7,000 people are wondering or thinking about.
Wow.
And so it gave me incentive to respond to those letters, but also think about those letters as a communicator, thinking this is how a lot of people feel. Now, of course, life went on. And then we got email, and now we have Twitter and we have Facebook. And to be honest with you, it's very hard to keep up with everybody's comments. And in fact, I would like to say right now, for anybody out there who has had comments from me and you're upset that I haven't got back to you, I promise you, I do the best I can.
I bet you do.
But these days it's hard to talk to everybody, which is yet another reason why I'm really appreciative that you all have this, because it allows me or others to talk to a lot of people who maybe are wondering or thinking about some of the same things. So that's the first part. The second part, as far as trust, and I'll try to be quick on this, but I remember. Now, my dad had nothing to do with television. He worked for DuPont and was a comptroller, and he was a numbers guy. But I remember him saying way early on, and it makes way more sense now. He said, Tim, just be yourself, because he said people are going to figure out if you're not. And now 40 years into this, I personally think, whether it's television or anything, that people need to trust you, or otherwise eventually they're going to go someplace else for information. So I totally agree with what you said about grandma. But I think people are going to trust you if you feel like you're being honest, which, since I'm human, means I'm not going to nail every forecast. And I remember early on occasionally being honest about that. And some people on my promotions team would say, Tim, you can't tell people that you missed the forecast. And I said, but I did. Now certainly I could see why if you miss too many forecasts, people are also going to turn away. But at least my little bit of experience tells me that I think people maybe not enjoy, but they might trust you more if you admit your mistakes occasionally. So as much as I don't ever want to make a mistake, and I always want to be perfect, and I always want to nail a forecast, ironically, the years have added up, and I think for me that for those who do trust me, in an odd kind of way, the fact that I've admitted to some of my mistakes has actually kind of helped that trust, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. I think these days that expression would be authentic content.
Perfect.
That's what people are looking
Perfect.
for. I know that you're pretty busy and you have to get going, so I thought I would wrap up this question with what I call the aha moment. It really surprises me sometimes when I learn that there's like whole channels of wind that are separated, like, closer to the ground, up in, further thousands of feet in the air. Is there essentially an established pattern or established channels of winds, sort of like the superhighway system, that it affects the entire globe, or are they separated by hemispheres? How does that work? Like the trade winds, the jet stream?
Great question, Harold. And I'm not exaggerating when I say every part of the earth is connected in some form or fashion by those channels of wind. And I think the channel of wind is a great way to put it. Sometimes I hesitate to say that because I think people then see that there's a separation. And although there are what we call significant levels, it's all connected. And I can't help but think about the pandemic, but there have been some, what I think are some pretty incredible computer model presentations. And it's just been like a CDC person trying to share the idea of how does, for lack of a better word, a germ get from one place to another. And they show a room without any and a room full of with just a tiny, and it's just random bouncing around of drops or dots. And you see that at some point these dots make it all over the place. And really, I'm not exaggerating to say that every molecule on Earth has been in some other location. It does that. Okay. With that said, yes, there are definitely channels. For instance, in meteorology, although the weather balloon, when it goes up, and I would say next to the satellite picture, the weather balloon, which has been around for a long time, is the most significant meteorological instrument we have. As it goes up and gives us data, it goes up through 30, 40, 50,000 feet. There are significant levels we always look at. We use them as pressure, but they're actually at levels. 850, there's a surface, of course, where we are. But if we really want to forecast what's going on, we need to know what's happening at all these different levels. So there's 850 millibars, which is about 5,000 feet. There's 10,000. There's then 700 millibars, which is 10,000 feet. There's 500 millibars, which is about 18,000 feet. And then we get up to 250, 200 millibars, which is 30,000 feet, which is the jet stream. And those type maps are looked at no matter what language you speak, no matter what part of the world you're in, by forecasters, by pilots, by anybody all over the world. In the tropics or the trade winds area, the weather at all levels is significant, but we watch the trade winds because that tends to tell us where the convection is going to go, energy that's coming from the surface. If you're north of the tropics, if you're just going to look at one level, we tend to look at the jet stream up at 30,000 feet because above the tropics, most of the storms really originate in what's happening at 30,000 feet. And then what's happening on the surface is a reflection of that. Now, if you heard the big difference there, it's one of the reasons why hurricane forecasting took the longest to reach what I would call the modern era. In other words, even when we started using computer models initially to forecast, let's say it was called the LFM, the limited fine mesh. It was back in the late 70s and early 80s. It went off the theory of, and it's a good theory, that whatever's happening on the surface where we are is a reflection of what's happening at 30,000 feet. The colder and windier it is at 30,000 feet, generally speaking, the stronger the storm's going to be on the surface. Tropics, hurricane, exact opposite. The warmer and the lighter the winds are at 30,000 feet, which means there isn't a jet stream, the stronger the hurricane can become on the surface. So a whole nother group of computer models had to be developed. And so if you really think about what I just said, it all interacts, then one of the most complicated forecasts to make is what happens now when this system in the tropics has developed where there's warm air and no wind at 30,000 feet, and it's now interacting with the polar jet stream. It's one of the toughest things to forecast, and guess what? Where we live in September and October and November here on the First Coast is where you have that interaction.
Right.
So that's a look at the global picture, and also my way of whining and saying that's why one of the toughest places to forecast is right here.
Well, and I always tell my friends that I feel like this part of the state, I always feel like this is where a lot of fronts kind of roll to their conclusion. Or I feel like we're always like, we border where the fronts decide to interact. And so it makes for interesting weather.
I'm sorry to continue to talk, but you're exactly right. And I'm really not whining here as much as if you think about it as a forecaster. And let's say it used to be 5-day work forecast, let's say 7-day forecast. And this works generally if you're at about 30 degrees north around the world. That during the cooler months of the year, if we want to know what's going to happen for the next 7 days, we're sort of looking upstream to our west for 7 days. During the tropical time of the year, we're looking east, right?
Okay.
For what might happen for 7 days. Well, what about the seasons in between? We're literally looking 7 days east and 7 days west.
Wow.
And where the two might meet, let's put it this way, forecasting is never boring.
It's kind of like that Venn diagram, but it's really unknown a lot of the times.
Yes, sir.
Well, we really appreciate the time you've given to us.
Thank you.
One of the things, I mean, it's funny, like, when you go to a party, everybody ends up in the kitchen. What is the topic that most people talk about with people they've met for the first time that makes them comfortable? It's the weather, because it's something we all have in common. If you had any particular message for the general public and the people of the First Coast that you'd like to share about our current experience, the weather, the outlook, or just, what you bring to the day, what do you think you'd like people to know?
I would say, especially because you're asking me right now during the pandemic, and as much as we know there's literally a global perspective on this pandemic. With all of that variety of how people feel about it, hopefully what I at least have observed, and I think this can come right back to weather, is that yes, it is inexact. Yes, there's a lot of variables, but there are some scientists out there that know at least a little more than the rest of us, and that they can at least give us guidance, and that in this way, at least we're prepared for something as opposed to being blind. And hopefully in some way that pandemic makes sense all the way down to, even if we don't want to take it to a hurricane here on the First Coast, even if it comes down to the thunderstorm. The thunderstorm locally we get so used to, we need the rain, but you know what? Day in and day out, I'm more concerned about what lightning might do to somebody or their family member versus necessarily the hurricane. I'll leave it with this. I think the more curious we are, as opposed to we know it all, the better prepared we're going to be for the future, whatever that might be. How about that?
That's great. I definitely think that's a way. Curiosity keeps us interested, and it makes life interesting, and ultimately will probably keep us safe.
Perfect.
Well, on behalf of our library system and community, I really want to say thank you for your time and your service, and we look forward to seeing you around these parts for many more years to come.
Well, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. Normally on TV, maybe I get 2 minutes at the most, so y'all have let me ramble on, and I do appreciate that.
Every bit of it's been informative, definitely. Thank you so much.
All right, y'all have a great day and have a great season.